I'm Nick Ishmael Perkins, a senior consultant with the International Science Council, and I imagine we would all agree that science and technological innovation are key to managing the climate crisis and delivering equitable, sustainable development across the world. Yet, in the last couple of years, we have seen how wariness of mainstream science can threaten health outcomes for us all. Speaking of the COVID pandemic, indeed, The Economist says, in the year to come, the issue is not access to vaccines so much as it is access to arms to vaccinate. Similarly, the IPCC has been warning for decades of what action is required by scientists, but those who would obstruct the recommendations of the science community remain both active and effective. This at a time when we have the technological capability and intellectual capacity to double the bank of human knowledge in a matter of months, not decades. So what can research institutions in particular do to respond to this crisis? The ISC thought that World Science Day seemed as good a day as any, and the launch of our multimedia hub Unlocking Science seemed as good a moment as any to reflect on this question. Before we get into the substance of the discussion, though, I have a few bits of housekeeping that I'd like to share with you. First, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. If you require any technical support, please raise your hand and one of the team will come to you. For questions, you can use the Q&A box. And if you want to comment on any of the proceedings, please share the chat. Now, to introduce our panel. First, Dr. Sasha Alte is a postdoctoral research fellow working on misinformation and mistrust at the University of Oxford with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He holds a PhD in experimental psychology. Dr. Marta Andrades is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Lisbon and a visiting scholar at London School of Economics. She's also a former Marie Curie Fellow and Fulbright Scholar. Professor Tuana Coupe is the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria since 2019. Dr. Courtney Raj is a journalist, scholar, and freedom of expression advocate who writes and speaks about the nexus of technology, media, and policy. She's also a fellow at the Center for Media, Data, and Society, among other things. And Vlada Tusko is Partnerships Manager for the BBC Storyworks, the in-house content agency at BBC Studios, who are producers of the Unlocking Science Hub I mentioned earlier. You can see a link to the hub in the chat. So let's start with outlining the problem we're faced with. Tuana, what is the distrust about which we are speaking? How bad is this problem?
I think that the most common manifestation of it these days is what is called fake news. Now, that's a very problematic term, as you know, invented by political populists in a short discussion like this, Donald Trump. And remember, what he calls fake news is what often is factual, evidence-based, scientific, rational, and the consensus. He calls that fake news. Now, the concept is proliferated and been popularized to the point of confusion, I think, because fake news actually is misinformation, disinformation, lies, and propaganda. And it is often associated with distrust for science, knowledge, institutions, and also for consensus, including medical consensus on things like vaccines. And so we face a particular pandemic on top of a pandemic when it relates to COVID-19, if you know. And I think this has been happening over a period of time. It's not just a recent phenomenon. Some of the distrust in institutions is also linked to the disconnections institutions have grown to have over time, if you like, and the lack of, if you like, more rational, more scientific, or more engaging from the scientific and the knowledge communities, like institutions like my university. And also remember that this distrust also has meant delegitimizing institutions like media that, you know, propagate factual or opinions based on facts, fact-check things, verified things, if you like. And also, third thing that has happened there is not the only one. The rise of digital technologies in everyone's palm and ability to do that share and push that share. And also in that toxic mix, if you like, you find a disrupted world. And I think that we need to recover this situation by restoring trust in institutions, but this can only not be by asserting your previous legitimacy. It is actually to find out what has made people distrust so many things and how to re-engage them away from populism of the right and populism of the left. And here I'm not meaning some wholly progressive center, if you like. I think that a reconnection of institutions and a reorientation to people feeling that they have a stake in the future and that we're in it together to save the planet and to save humanity.
Thank you, Tawana. I think that was a really sobering, but also very clear outline of what the context is that we're faced with globally. I now want to turn to Sasha and ask him, as an experimental psychologist, what do you make of the distrust that we're faced with? Again, you know, how is this expressed? Where is it coming from?
First, it depends what we are talking about, because it must be said that people around the world trust scientists a lot. Almost everyone thinks that scientists are competent, but not everyone is convinced that scientists have people's interest at heart. So it's important that scientists talk to people just to show that even if we don't always have people's best interest at heart, at least we have good intentions, you know? But that being said, people, they often learn about science via the media or social media, and people don't trust the media, and they trust social media even less. So one big challenge today, I think, is to increase trust in the media. It means better communicating about the work that journalists do, but also being irreproachable as journalists. You know, journalists also need to connect with people, especially with those who feel that they are not well represented in the news, such as minorities. And the consequences of distrust are various. One I'm particularly interested in, and that Tawana talked about, is misinformation consumption. People consume fake news and conspiracy theories because they distrust the establishment and are skeptical of anything that the media or the government says. So one big consequence of distrust is that people are uninformed because they reject reliable information from the media. So they are less knowledgeable about politics and things like that. So I think that increasing distrust is really a big challenge, and more so, I believe, than reducing the spread of misinformation, because it's actually the same thing. People consume misinformation for the same reason that they are uninformed and don't trust the media.
I think this is a really interesting perspective on the issue, which is actually, you know, kind of being able to separate trust from this issue of being misinformed or disinformed. Now, in the face of this, what do we know about how research institutions are communicating? And Marta, you've just done, I think, a really interesting study of research institution communication practices. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Sorry, Marta, you're muted.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Nick, for this question, which I will address, bringing some observations of the study you just mentioned, that has investigated these exact questions in 8 countries in different parts of the world. I'll make a few observations. The first is that we find growing communication activity at research institutes within universities. There is, however, a predominant focus on one-way communication models and activities. The second observation is that we observe also a trend towards professionalization of science communication at the level of research institutes. And this is seen in increased resources that are being allocated, such as funding for communications, specialization of the communication staff, and also adoption of policies or guidelines for public engagement. And we observe these tendencies in all countries. So it's not a characteristic of a single country, but it's rather what we think is an international phenomenon, these growing activities and focus on science communication. Another observation that I would like to make is that we find that this allocation of resources has a stronger effect on media communication rather than other institutional activities, which might suggest some priority goals on public visibility. And from these observations arise questions that we need to think about, and an important one concerns the role of science communication within scientific institutions. what uses are institutions making of science communication, and how do they see their role in facilitating public engagement in research. One could ask, is science communication a tool for institutional promotion and visibility, or genuine civic engagement? And I think this kind of brings us to a paradox between what institutions are expected to do and what institutions might actually be doing and want to get out of their communication. And for this reason, I think that we need to think about the role of science communication within the organization and observe what is, and take this seriously and discuss how can institutions actually create the conditions in which the goals of civic engagement is possible and becomes endemic. So I think I would leave this here.
No, I think I'm full of follow-up questions for you. But before we do that, I want to invite Courtney to speak. I know, Courtney, in the past we have talked, and you have been very clear and eloquent, dare I say, even compelling, about some of the blind spots that institutions, research institutions, have around the way they approach science communication. Do you want to say a little bit about something around the current practice?
Sure. Thanks so much for bringing this important topic on World Science Day to the forefront. I think that there are a few categories of why institutions are facing challenges communicating around science, as well as why there is a lack of trust among the public around science and around journalism. First, we don't talk a lot about how science is done. So I think there is a lot of focus on the results of science, but not so much understanding what is science. Science is actually about the best known facts based on current understanding, not necessarily the definitive truth. And I think that there is some disconnect in how scientists and how institutions that communicate about science help the public understand how science works. And you can really see that during the pandemic, during COVID-19, where this, as it was called, the novel coronavirus, we did not know a lot about it. Things were being learned. But I think that some of the public communication around that seemed to indicate that, oh, this is the truth about what we know about the pandemic, but not recognizing that will evolve. It will evolve as new information comes up, as more people get sick and recover, as new developments are made in vaccinations, et cetera. That I think was poorly communicated by scientists, by public officials, and by journalists. So, but there's also, I think, a concern around focusing on publications in peer-reviewed journals. This is very important, but that can't be the end-all be-all. It also needs to be translated, in my opinion, to journalists. Journalists are the ones who typically communicate with the public sphere, with the broader public, most of the general public. And I would say, even, general policymakers aren't reading the original source. They're reading an interpretation, an analysis, a description of a study or a new finding or whatever it may be. So the fact that these peer review journals are typically closed to open, they're not open access. We still have this you have to pay to gain access to that. That means that much of the world is not able to gain access to that, not just the public, but even scientists and academics who would like to use that information because it is economically prohibitively expensive. So we should be thinking about the disconnect between these closed bodies of knowledge with good scientific information and how our public sphere and our information ecosystem is designed, which is primarily intermediated by social media platforms. So if most people are getting their information through social media platforms and or through journalism, much of which of those overlap, then science communicators need to think about how they take advantage of the properties of social media, which are based on algorithmic amplification, based on recommendations, on likes, on extremism, on opinions, often much more so than fact. The fact that you don't have information out there, for example, because it's behind a paywall or because it's not indexed, can have severe repercussions, because we also know that, it's not just about the spread of disinformation on social media. Part of the reason it spreads is because there are information black holes. So if there are perhaps, scientific articles on a topic, but they're not out there in the public sphere with keywords, with hashtags, things that will get picked up in that information sphere, then it can be really hard for that information to compete, because there's this black hole that disinformation can fill. And then in terms of the role of the news media and journalism, I think this is very linked to scientific communication. The fact that you have the degradation of the journalism industry around the world, the decline in the number of journalists employed, the beats they cover, and the fact that you don't have a lot of journalists these days who are focused on the science beat, and the fact that science is actually interwoven and interfused with so much of our daily life. And yet, even if there is a science journalist, it's probably on a science beat that's considered, hard science. So I think that we really need to look at the whole information ecosystem, including the news media, social media, and publishing, and work on that so that we can address this lack of trust in all these institutions.
Thank you, Courtney. I think, again, lots of food for thought in there, but I want to continue from where you ended, which is talking about the whole information ecosystem, and particularly the role for some content providers and creators. And now turn to Vlada and ask her to share a little bit about the approach that BBC Storyworks uses as a content creator. And drawing from, for instance, the Unlocking Science Multimedia Hub, maybe you have some examples there to share. Nudge, nudge.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And great to be here, everybody. We exist in a slightly different world to you, but certainly as content producers at BBC Storyworks, we too think about and reflect on ways to tell stories authentically and credibly all the time, and storytelling, if done well, can be a really powerful tool to achieve that engagement with the audience and build trust. Although it's not always easy in an increasingly crowded digital landscape, but there are several principles of storytelling that we are often guided by and certainly applied in the creation of a most recent project, which we produced for the International Science Council, Unlocking Science. One of those principles, and we think that's particularly important for stories that could be particularly technical or complex, is that it's important for a story, yes, to provide insight, yes, to educate, but also to some extent to entertain and to create that emotional connection with the audience, even if it might sound counterintuitive. I guess taking storytelling as an example, it is tempting to often emphasize detailed data methodology, perhaps results alone, as Courtney said. But actually, we find that in telling stories about science, particularly as part of this project that we've worked on, unless a story has the ability to, unless it feels relatable and relevant and accessible to an audience, if the desire is to engage a wider audience, then that story might not manage to convey its content as impactfully. We know that emotionally resonant narrative actually tends to be more memorable. So one way to achieve that, in our experience, is to share as much as possible first-hand experiences and human perspectives. So to kind of draw from the project that we created, this is a collection of short films and written pieces that we've produced to ultimately showcase transformative science around the world, but also to engage the wider audience with the topic of science beyond the scientific community itself. And whilst showcasing examples of success stories and progress. We also, in short, tell those stories through that lens of lived experience, through the perspective of the individuals around the world whose lives and livelihoods depend on science. And in some instances, through the experience of communities who often play a really active role in co-creating scientific solutions that are needed locally. And so what we then created, we hope and think, is a collection of stories that have the right balance between scientific expertise, but also those personal experiences that can help achieve that emotional impact that we aim for. Another principle that we find useful is something that we call a solution-focused storytelling approach, which is really a narrative framework that ensures that when we cover subject matter that is complex and nuanced, that we have sort of a meaningful conversation around that topic. So in this case, for instance, we worked with a number of organizations, leading institutions from the global scientific community, profiling incredible transformative work they're doing. And when working with organizations, as we often do, it is easy to fall into the trap of only sharing stories of success and progress. But that can sometimes feel one-sided and perhaps even inauthentic. So it is also very important to talk about the challenges facing the scientific community, the stumbling blocks standing in the way of progress. Adopting this kind of a radical transparency, almost a kind of vulnerability to speak about the difficulties, can really help engage an audience, build trust, certainly, and enrich a narrative. And that's another principle we aimed to kind of apply across the board, ensuring that we do celebrate stories of progress, but ensuring that we don't lose sight of those challenges too.
Thank you, Vlada. I think that this idea of radical honesty, it matches very well, I think, with the point that Courtney was making as well about, the issue around how science is practiced. It's actually not necessarily about declarations of certainty. It's not even necessarily about celebrating hero scientists as individuals. It's really about the systemic and really quite incremental diminishment of uncertainty. And that this is in its own way is quite a challenging thing. Now, what I want to do is we open up a discussion to talk about some of the responses here. I'm going to come to you, Tawana, to ask you about this issue. What Vlada just described, this idea about actually how do we get it to make narrative around science, and that's emotionally resonant. How do we socialize science? What does that imply for you as, thinking about as a research manager? What does that imply about how your institute needs to be positioned?
I think interesting question. The one thing that I think that she said, which is in several other colleagues just said now, is that you have to make scientific discourse translated into public discourses that link to people's everyday life. Remember, we have one problem. The one thing that when I did my PhD in media studies at the University of Oslo, I was so grateful that I could do that. Because let's accept it, not many people understand how the media works either. And that is why today, people do not make a distinction between, credible institutions of journalism and what is called social media. The word social doesn't help either. All media, by the way, is actually social. So the concept social media is a misnomer. But layer this on the following, where people don't understand how media selects stories and that media also targets audiences. And often it appears that media are enhancing the language of the scientists or the knowledge producers, which is a language of the few. So if you like, popularizing without dumping down that discourses of science is very, very important. So how do you translate a complex journal article and a book, an award-winning, a citation from a Nobel Prize winning author into something ordinary Jack and Jill can understand and relates to their life is the big challenge of the day. And remember also, so today, it's very funny that there's more knowledge about so many things that we are rich in knowledge, but people are actually less knowledgeable, despite the ideology also from social media. Where does that gap come from? It's lack of translation, it's lack of media literacy, information literacy, and today digital literacies. Now, and also my last point, if you don't mind, is You know that when you go to school, people always give the impression science, particularly mathematics, is very difficult. So the very idea of science is associated with a few people and with a complexity beyond people's minds. And that's why you find across the world, women and certain people from minorities won't take certain subjects. They are difficult, they are for the elite and so on. So we have to deconstruct all of that so that it becomes ordinary, if you like, and linked to ordinary people's lives and communicated in ways they can relate to. So storytelling cultures, narratives in people's lives are useful things to, if you like, co-opt into making science more popular.
So if I understand correctly, now I'm thinking about looking at this through the lens of institutional transformation. So does that mean that, for instance, the University of Pretoria really is going to be investing in media literacy, scientific literacy, and the popularization of these, and also investing in narrative making and socialization of science? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So we've launched a science communication course, which frankly, as the Vice Chancellor, I want every academic to take, because it's no longer sufficient to publish in popular in the top journals. It's expected, right? That's what I pay you for, put it that way. But we need to do much more to engage society and be more impactful. So to be critical media literacy, science communication, information literacy, and ways in which you can be engaging to the public. To be quite frank, not everybody is suitable to do that, right? So my aspiration for everybody is, but at least some people must have an understanding that their intellectual discourse, scientific discourse is not public discourse. And so we work with The Conversation, for example, started in Australia. There's a branch in Africa, The Conversation Africa.
Yes.
And The Conversation Africa works with our academics to try and translate, if you like, their academic scientific discourses into the language of credible media, fact-checked, verified,
Yes.
engaging, using storytelling narratives and all of that. So
Okay.
that Conversation Africa is a key partner in that regard.
Thank you, Tawana. I'm just mindful of the time, and I want to hear, I want to come back to Marta, because I think that what you've done is reminded me of a point that I think Marta made about creating the conditions for what you call, Marta, the civic engagement, which is really at the heart of science communication. So explain a little bit about what some of these conditions might look like based on the study.
A bit of it was already mentioned by Tawana. I mean, it's important to support researchers above all, because they are actually one of the main groups that actually go out and communicate what institutions are doing or what they are doing at institutions. So this group is actually a priority, and this can come in different ways, as Tawana told, like training.
Sorry, I was just going to say, actually, Marta, and I think this is an extremely important point that is often overlooked, because we think about institutions doing the communication, we think about institutions doing but in fact, what you're saying, and the significance of this should not be underestimated, is that no, we are talking about researchers.
We're talking about
research programs. Yes,
indeed, we are talking about researchers, and we are talking about other actors within the institutional environment, such as the science communicators, the practitioners as well. So these people might have a very important role supporting the work of researchers on the one hand, but also communicating other things that institutions want to bring out to the public, and is a different work from scientists' communications or job. So there's two things, like supporting also the development of, I would say, the science communicators' identity, because it's very dispersed at the moment. They actually do different tasks, and this can actually be a barrier to this growing of professionalization of science communication at institutions. So that's another thing, support the scientific, the practitioners, the science communicators working at institutions as well. And another thing that I think is very important is actually this collaboration between the academics and the institutions and the actors within the institutions, again, the scientists and again, the practitioners, the science communicators, because it seems this goes a little bit along the lines of what I was saying before, this paradox. we expect from institutions and what actually institutions are doing. And so it seems that we academics talk about some things, but institutions either don't get the message or lost the message is somehow lost, or the interests are others. And so, you know, these collaboration, strengthening this collaboration between these two groups is another thing that I think institutions might have a crucial role. And
yeah, I think this is a really important point, because oftentimes people say, oh yeah, maybe you should employ some science communicators or something. But then, as you're saying, actually, it's not about just having the bodies there. It's really about the intention and about the relationship and the environment and culture that supports that. I think it's
indeed, and the institution as facilitator of, you know, this growing activity in different dimensions.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask Sasha about, because I know that you've been involved in some experiments, so we're kind of going now at a slightly different angle. Some experiments around how we actually try to redress issues of mistrust or distrust. Do you want to say something about that, and you know what some of these experiments have been and what the implications might be for researchers or research institutions?
Well, it's actually very difficult, and my experiments weren't on increasing trust, but rather informing people. So, for example, we've developed chatbots to inform people about COVID-19 vaccines. So it's a chatbot basically where people can say what they are concerned about, for example, the vaccine safety or the vaccine's efficacy. And the chatbot answers with like the most up-to-date scientific knowledge about it in a like easy way to understand. So we developed chatbots, and it works very well to inform people about the science of GMOs or the science of vaccines. But it's not exactly on trust. Like increasing trust is, I think, really hard. And actually, I don't know of any very good interventions that increases trust in the long term.
This is a very, very sobering point, because if, as you say, what is fundamental here is about trust, and we know that that trust can take a long time to build. It's completely fundamental, because actually, as you suggested, you know, it's about, suddenly then it becomes about who communicates, where they're positioned or located relative to different groups. But trust can also be, it takes a long time to build, but it can erode very quickly.
Yes.
So yes. It's a very, yes, go on.
Yeah, one example, for example, and something I think we should avoid, but everyone agrees on that, is politicization of scientific issues. For example, when mask wearing became a political issue in the US, it became much harder to change people's mind. Like when a scientific topic is not politicized, when you provide people with good arguments, they change their mind basically. But when something is political and is linked to their political ideology or identities, it becomes much harder because it's something they use to signal group membership and many of the social functions that are very hard to disrupt.
Yeah, I want to say here, I'm going to come to Courtney in a minute, so, because I know that she has spoken about this before. I just want to say that actually it's interesting because the ISC has just published a discussion paper that talks about, among other things, the importance of social identity and building public perceptions of science. And we can share that link in the chat. Courtney, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Sasha said, because I think there are important interventions to be made in the media environment in terms of filling out information voids, providing accurate information. But there's also, as you said, it takes a long time to build trust. And we have seen that the decline of trust in institutions like journalism, like science, like politics, has actually also followed the decline in local journalism. And I think that there's a link there, because not only are opinions now about the pandemic very related to your political viewpoints, that is very reinforced by the media ecosystem and the media that are communicating. And it's not just like social media, obviously, it's also mainstream media. Most people around the world still get information from radio, from television, et cetera. And so, I think that we really need to think about also how the challenges facing journalism and their inability to work at the local level, which helps people understand the relationship between useful information and their daily life, which can then be really important during a global pandemic. That is one of the impacts. It also is related to the, lacking the personnel, the experts to cover scientific developments and to do that well. I think that these are all interrelated because, again, like most people are not getting their information directly from a source. And so it's really, it's important to think about the information environment. And when we think about interventions, I think things like, chatbots, like thinking about how can we indicate the integrity of information online, news integrity, very important. But we also need to look at these broader structural factors about how do we support good information. And that is, good old fashioned journalism. We don't need, a cool new algorithm or technological development. We need to double down on what we know works, which is quality journalism as an antidote to disinformation and misinformation.
And do you think actually, Courtney, by extension, that actually research institutions should be building stronger, clearer relationships with internet governance agencies and structures?
Yes, I think that would be a great thing to do. The Internet Governance Forum. I'm on GigaNet, which is the global internet governance for body of scholars who work on these topics. Let's connect these so that we learn from each other. It's great to see Sasha here, who's at the Reuters Institute, which is doing great work. But I actually really, when Marta was talking about, the work that she's doing with institutions and researchers, what does that mean in practice? Are researchers and are they getting media training, like how to talk to the press? Are institutions sending out really good storytelling press releases about the latest developments? Are they, what are they doing to support that actually getting out? Do they have lists of journalists that they build relationships with so that they can help translate that? Again, I think that it would be really interesting to think about, what does that support look like that Marta is talking about? And building on what Vlada was saying, how is it not just about the information, but the storytelling about why that information matters and how that connects to somebody's daily life?
I think this is actually a very interesting point. Sasha, I see you're nodding your head. Was there something you wanted to add? I just want to say, actually, before you respond, Sasha, we're going to do a poll where we invite participants to rank, because we've been keeping track of the various responses, institutional responses. And so in a couple of minutes, we're going to invite folks to select what they would see as their 3 priority responses. And then we'll ask the panel to respond to the results of the poll. So we'll do that in a couple of minutes. But Sasha, before we do, I was
just agreeing with Courtney.
But do you think, because what I think is really interesting about what Courtney has said, and it kind of relates a bit to your point, what can institutions do to design for trust?
It's too big of a question. I don't know. I don't know.
You have to give it a shot.
No.
I would weigh in. I think you kind of mentioned it, Sasha, when you were talking earlier about, when the mask issues came out in the United States, the reporting, both from the scientists direct, because they had a lot of press conferences that were direct, from the scientists themselves, and the reporting on this indicated in the United States, masks are not effective at preventing this spread. Okay. With all due respect, I did not believe that. That doesn't make any sense logically. Mm-hmm. And, there was kind of this inclination that it was linked to a potential shortage of supply. They really should have been very upfront about that from the outset, because that set us on a path at the very beginning of distrusting the scientific analysis, thinking that they're telling us one thing because they have this other very valid interest in mind, but that does not build trust. And that was at the very beginning of this thing.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really interesting example, actually. We're going to start the poll now. And while actually folks are completing this poll, which is now being shared. So the question is, which of these 3 do you think should be priority responses for research institutions? You can choose up to 3. I'm assuming that everybody can see the poll. While you have a couple of minutes to fill that out, I want to ask a question of the panel. Now, I think that there is a bit of a notion, right, around this kind of old-fashioned public sphere idea that somehow, there's a natural balance between the science community, the public, and policy. But we know that there are people who are adversarial advocates actively seeking to disrupt this. We've seen even within social media, we had the whistleblower from Facebook who said actually there are algorithms there that actually are seeking to create communities that sometimes will be propagating misinformation. How do we respond to that as research institutions or researchers, to go to Marta's point? Does anybody have any idea? There's a lot of money there. How do we respond to this? And as I say, while you're responding to that, it gives a minute for the audience to complete the poll.
At the risk of repeating myself, fundamental to this is how the general public and even legislators or policymakers don't understand how it works. The whistleblowers are giving us a lecture or a lesson in how it actually works, which we, or even some of us who know a lot did not actually know. And so the policymakers haven't been making the policy that protects the public interest or the public good. So in the spaces entered, let me be frank, greedy corporations with their algorithms worsening a social problem. So the better people know how these things work in the public in general and policymakers, then you can find public interested regulation that does not trump freedom of speech and freedom of the media. Because that is where often it's if you see the tech giants, Zuckerberg, Facebook, you often defend these things on the basis of promoting free speech, but actually limiting free speech in practice with these algorithms or promoting certain speech at the expense of other speech that is in the public interest. So not having general policy debates about how media works and information works and the technologies works to those who want to disrupt the public interest or the public good, which by that I mean information that empowers people to make and understand choices that better their lives.
Thank you. Toronto. Sorry, go on, Courtney.
I think Tawana definitely is right about, the some part of it is this lack of understanding of how things work. That is in large part related to the fact that we do not have access to data and information from these very influential companies, and that regulators have not stepped in to mandate how to have that access in a privacy respecting way so that scientists can do research. So, there was Social Science 1, this project with Facebook, which was essentially a huge disaster because they really did not provide necessary data. Facebook has rescinded access from researchers who have, created databases and done actually public science where they've created plugins that anyone can use to help feed them information, for example, about their ads database because they don't have direct access. Facebook shut that down. So I would say one big thing that the scientific community should get behind are these campaigns to mandate access to data for independent researchers. Clearly, there will need to be accreditation processes and safeguards put in place, and we need to make sure that there's equitable access, so it's not just North American or European researchers, but we have to have access to the data, because the fact is, there as a community in the internet governance community, in the disinformation research community, where Frances Haugen's revelations were not. I mean, we knew that, we just didn't have the proof. Furthermore, we should have regulations that require companies to clearly report on the scientific experiments that they're doing on their users, as well as to provide accurate information based on what right now only they have the data that can show that information. There need to be greater safeguards. That is where regulators can come in and do something really useful without worrying about the free, without trampling or rescinding free speech rights.
Thank you, Courtney. Marta, I want to ask very quickly, in your research, did this issue come up at all? Just very quickly. You're on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry again. We have not looked at these.
I mean, but based on the conversations that you've been having, how do you think people they're not thinking about this? Do they think it's too big an issue? Have they? Yeah, what's your feeling based on your proximity to these researchers and the research programs?
I think they do feel they're needed, but the focus has been probably more in other issues, such as I mentioned here, getting messages out there that is more related to findings, for example, than the processes of communication is getting something out, is being in the game.
Yeah, okay, I understand.
And they put resources, and these resources are particularly important for the media communications.
Okay. Thank you. So what I'm going to ask now to share the results of the poll, and then I'm going to ask our panelists so I think you should be able to see the results, to reflect on what you're seeing and in the last few minutes that we have. And I'm afraid, Vlada, I'm going to start by coming to you. And if you just take a few 60 seconds actually to reflect on what you're seeing. Are you surprised by anything? Disgusted?
Certainly, it feels like questions around the need to invest in communication around science, from what I can see, are kind of indexing on the higher end. And I guess coming back to where I can share an opinion, certainly connected to the project that we've just worked on, having had the opportunity to work very closely with a variety of institutions across the scientific community, telling their story, in some cases difficult, complex, nuanced stories. In each case, the challenge for us as storytellers and content creators was always, how do we break this down in a way that actually will engage a broad and diverse audience? How do we invite those that normally don't engage with scientific subject matter because perhaps they don't feel qualified? How do we invite them to engage with it and realize that actually it is relevant to them? We all depend on science every day, and even if some of it is complex and nuanced, it is worth engaging with it. So in telling stories, in kind of finding ways to translate, into human experiences, personal stories, that's our way to kind of break down, clarify the scientific endeavor, the process, that kind of engage audiences with some of the individuals working behind the scenes, and hopefully invite a broad audience to engage with the subject matter. So from that perspective alone, it feels not surprising that there's a desire and an encouragement that more investment in ways to communicate about science should happen, and I certainly agree.
Thank you, Vlada. Sasha, your thoughts, reflections on the poll?
I don't have any profound reflections. I don't have anything interesting to add to what Vlada said. So.
I mean, are you surprised by anything? It doesn't have to be profound.
No, I think engaging with. No, I think it makes sense.
Okay. Marta.
Well, it's interesting to look at these results. There's a red one here that is the provide systemic training in science communication, including public engagement, is 69% of the votes here, which is not surprising. This is actually some of the issues that we've talked about here, and that research has shown that has some effect on the practices of scientists. So it's not surprising that people think that institutions should put some more investments in training, and not only scientists, but professional science, the communicators or the practitioners at institutions that many times do not have background in science communications. And I'm talking about at the research level rather than the PR people, okay?
Yeah.
So it's not surprising, and is interesting to see. But there's one thing that I would just like to say to finalize about this training in science communication, also including scientists, because what the research also shows is that one of the main drivers, if not the biggest driver for scientists to go public, is actually their intrinsic motivations. And so institutions should also be thinking a little bit about how to support the autonomy of scientists and the satisfaction of scientists to go and protect their intrinsic motivations as well, because otherwise this can be, the other way around, counterproductive. To reward, for example, when someone is actually doing something because they internally feel, that they should be doing it, and they have the strength to do it because of other reasons, not because they are being rewarded or something like that.
I mean, and I think actually one of the things, again, in that discussion paper about the current discourse on public engagement with science that I mentioned that the ISC has produced, is that we see how important intention is when it comes to public engagement with science, science communication.
Indeed.
And it speaks again to this issue of trust that Sasha has been talking about. Okay, Tawana, any reflections? You must be very pleased to see the systemic training that you are modeling at the University of Pretoria.
Yeah, I'm very pleased about that. But also, what I'm pleased about, what I'm concerned about is that the items that receive low percentage are integrally important to ensuring that that systemic process actually happens. These issues are actually interlinked. The intergovernance and free speech, which are the policy issues, and the literacies around how, remember that the public engagement with scientists will be through the media. Now, do the public understand the media? We will just say that they don't trust the media. So I could well be backing up the wrong tree here. More well-trained scientists and all of that with facts, and also trying to be engaging using a platform that is not trusted, or a platform that is not trusted nor understood. So I would like to see some kind of looking at the whole value chain, if you like, because that is also at the end of the day, how people should understand how things in society are interlinked and interrelated. More understanding of everything helps you still become familiar and more comfortable with everything, if you like. Sounds reductive, but that's very, very important. But yes, I am pleased that people believe systemic training, more engagement with scientists, not just institutions, is vitally important. And I agree with Marta that scientists must be free to speak out and not also be constrained by the institutions who might be beholden to some other vested interests. People who fund science and people who are donors to the university and all of that.
Yeah.
Increases distrust, if you like.
Yes, I understand this completely, and I think actually it is, again, because Courtney has made this point very clearly, very compellingly, that we really have got to be thinking about this holistically. And I think that you have also indicated the significance of that. Courtney, your reflections.
Yeah. Obviously we have a constrained choice set, so I'm kind of disappointed to see that number 3 is so low, but I think that I understand why, because I think this is not about engaging with campaigns. It's about engaging with those research communities. Journalists, scientists, they see themselves as independent, typically non-activists, which I think is fine. So maybe the campaigns idea turns them off, but I think the idea of connecting with research communities, as you're doing in this panel right here with the researchers who, how the social psychology of communication, the internet, digital technologies that mediate our communication, the media ecosystem, et cetera, is all really important, because again, science, you can have the most well-trained scientists, but if you don't have the right media lists and you don't have relationships with journalists, or you don't have journalists with whom to communicate because those beats have all gone by the wayside, that communication training isn't going to get you very far.
Yeah, no, this is the reality, right, of the day-to-day business of communicating. We have here, actually, we included this, the Article 27 profiling, because actually, you know, we know that there is some discussion about having an international year for basic science or basic education. There's also discussion about an international year for scientific public engagement and so on. And so and there is a feeling that if you look at, say, back in the 50s, when you had the International Year of Polar Science, that was really quite transformative in the public discourse and the importance and fascination with the polar ice caps, and that maybe something like that could have a similarly transformative impact. And that's where that came from. Does anybody want to reflect on the value of that?
I mean, I think that could be helpful. Again, you know, if we're thinking about how to focus attention, how to, you know, get communicators to devote resources, that could be helpful. I mean, what's interesting is today is World Science Day. I didn't know that until being on this panel. I celebrate, or as it were, World Press Freedom Day, which is May 3rd. So maybe, you know, more of these sort of commemorative and putting a lot of resources towards really thinking about and identifying these as key issues would be really helpful. I mean, we're in the midst of the, you know, of COP27 and they're in Glasgow. This is all very related to the issues that we're discussing today. I mean, we didn't mention climate change and that the whole issue of science communication related to that. But I think that, again, if there's something that could be designated that would not only, you know, engage the science community, but really all of these communities that need to reinforce the efforts to build trust, to enhance credibility of institutions and counteract this disinformation trend, I think it could be helpful.
Thank you, Courtney. There was one question I thought was really interesting, and Marta, I'm going to put this to you, and I'm going to be really unfair and give you one sentence to respond because we're running out of time. But it says, actually, do we think that people will be more inclined to trust an institution than an individual researcher? And of course, this is the tension of, you know, that you've been speaking about between who actually does the communication in practice, the researchers, as opposed to the institution.
Well, I think we can't dissociate both, right? Because I mean, if you're talking about scientists working for the industry or scientists working for scientific organizations, public scientific organizations, I would say public scientific organizations, because these are the results of the studies we've known forever. But with the question I see here is actually about individual communicators or institutional communicators. Mm-hmm. So I'm reading these as practitioners, not scientists.
Okay.
And I think the rationale is the same. I would think that institutional communicators would be more trusted than individual or people, you know, communicating science outside, unless you've got a profile and, you know, because otherwise I think the institution is really in the back, you know, and it's the institution that is doing something, and the individuals are part of the institution. But nevertheless, the fame or the disgrace will always be for the institution, not for the individuals themselves.
I mean, of course, there's still the challenge that the institution has to be socialized. And this is the point I think that Tawana was making earlier, is that, you know, you're still going to think the institution is still located within some kind of social structures and historical continuities and so on. I'm afraid that we have run out of time. I want to thank the panelists for being so generous with their time, their expertise, and their reflections. I want to thank you for joining us, the audience, and of course, the organizers at the ISC behind the scenes who have made this possible, and our hosts, the Berlin Science Festival, for all of their support. And we encourage you to go forward and fight the good fight for good science. Thank you all.